My father left his entire estate to my stepbrother. I got an old wooden box and a letter nobody was supposed to find. If someone had asked me 6 months ago what my father would leave me after he died, I wouldn't have said, money. I would have said answers. Instead, I got neither. Or at least, that's what I believed on the day the attorney read the will. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 32, and I grew up in a small town outside Lexington, Kentucky. My dad, Robert Carter, owned a successful construction company that he'd built from the ground up. It wasn't some massive corporation, but it was enough to make him comfortable. He owned a beautiful farmhouse, several rental properties, investment accounts, and the business itself. People in town respected him. Some even feared him. He had the kind of personality that filled every room he walked into, unless you were me. Then, it mostly filled the room with silence. My parents divorced when I was 9. Nobody ever told me the whole story. One day, Mom was living with us. The next day, she wasn't. Within 18 months, Dad married Linda. She came with a son named Ryan, who was almost exactly my age. Ryan wasn't a bad kid. That's what made everything harder. He wasn't cruel. He didn't bully me. He didn't try to replace me. He simply fit. Dad loved baseball. Ryan loved baseball. Dad loved fishing. Ryan loved fishing. Dad worked construction. Ryan wanted to work construction. Meanwhile, I spent weekends reading books or taking apart old radios just to see how they worked. Dad called it wasting time. When I was 14, I built my first computer from used parts I'd bought online. I was unbelievably proud of it. I carried it downstairs and showed Dad. He barely looked up from the television. That's nice. Ryan walked into the room carrying a tackle box. Dad stood immediately. You ready to hit the lake? The computer stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days before anyone noticed it. Mom always told me not to take it personally. Your father just doesn't understand people who are different from him. Maybe. But understanding and loving aren't the same thing. By the time I graduated high school, I'd already decided I wasn't staying in Kentucky. I earned a scholarship to Purdue, studied software engineering, and eventually settled in Indianapolis. I built a career, bought a condo, made a life that had nothing to do with construction sites or fishing boats. Dad rarely called. When he did, conversations lasted less than 5 minutes. You working? Yeah. Good. That was usually enough. Ryan stayed home. He joined Dad's company right after high school. Within a few years, everyone in town talked about them like they were partners instead of father and son. At family gatherings, Dad introduced Ryan as the future of Carter Construction. Then he'd gesture toward me. And this is Ethan. He's into computers. Like I collected stamps as a hobby instead of writing software for a living. Linda always smiled awkwardly when that happened. Ryan usually changed the subject. He knew it bothered me. He just never knew what to say. Over time, I visited less. Not because I hated them. Because every visit reminded me that I felt like a guest in the house where I'd grown up. The last real conversation I had with Dad happened about 8 months before he died. He called unexpectedly. I need someone to look at my laptop. I laughed. So that's why you called. You still good with those things? I make a living doing it. Right. I drove 3 hours that Saturday. His laptop had a failing hard drive. I replaced it, recovered his files, and even showed him how to back everything up. When I finished, he looked genuinely impressed. I don't know how you do all this. It's just what I do. He nodded slowly. I guess it's important. Those 4 words meant more to me than they should have. For the first time in years, it felt like he actually saw me. As I packed my tools, he said something strange. You know. He hesitated. I've made mistakes. I looked at him. He wasn't a man who admitted mistakes. What do you mean? He leaned back in his chair. I'll figure it out. Before I could ask what that meant, Linda walked into the room asking about dinner. The moment disappeared. I wish I'd pushed harder. 3 months later, he suffered a massive heart attack while inspecting a job site. He survived the ambulance ride. He didn't survive surgery. The funeral was packed. Contractors, employees, neighbors, former clients, men who'd worked beside him 30 years earlier. Everyone had a story about Robert Carter. I listened politely while wondering why it felt like they all knew a different man than I did. After the service, Ryan hugged me. "I'm glad you came. I wouldn't miss it." He looked exhausted. So did Linda. Grief has a way of making everyone look older. A week later, we met at Dad's attorney's office. There were only 4 of us. Linda, Ryan, me, and Mr. Holloway, Dad's lawyer for almost 20 years. His office smelled like old books and coffee. He adjusted his glasses before opening a thick folder. "Your father updated his estate plan approximately 11 months ago." I didn't think much of that. People update wills all the time. He began reading. Linda received the farmhouse and several retirement accounts. That seemed fair. Then came the business. "I leave Carter Construction Incorporated, all associated equipment, vehicles, business accounts, and commercial properties to my stepson, Ryan Mitchell." Ryan blinked. "What?" Mr. Holloway continued. "Additional investment accounts, rental properties, land, nearly everything else. Also to Ryan." I waited. Surely there was another paragraph, something, anything. Instead, Mr. Holloway looked directly at me. "To my son, Ethan Carter." Finally. "I leave the wooden keepsake box currently stored in my personal workshop." Silence. "Along with its contents." That was it. I actually thought he was joking. Ryan looked horrified. "There has to be more." "There isn't," the attorney replied quietly. Linda stared at the paperwork. "I didn't know he changed it." "Neither did I." Ryan immediately turned toward me. "Ethan." I held up my hand. "It's fine." It wasn't. Not even close. I wasn't upset about the money. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. What hurt was the message. Ryan got the company because Dad believed in him. Ryan got the properties because Dad trusted him. I got a wooden box. On the drive back to the farmhouse, nobody said much. Ryan kept apologizing. "I swear I didn't know." "I know. If you want, we can figure something out." I shook my head. Dad made his decision. Even if I didn't understand it, the workshop sat behind the house exactly as I remembered. The smell of sawdust hit me the second I opened the door. Every tool still hung neatly on the wall. Everything had its place. Ryan walked to an old shelf in the corner. There! A small wooden box sat beneath a dusty canvas. It was beautifully made, walnut wood, brass hinges, hand-carved edges. I recognized it immediately. Dad built it when I was about 12. I'd watched him sand every corner. I'd asked who it was for. He smiled and said, "Someone important." Apparently, that someone was me. Ryan handed it over carefully. "I'm sorry." I nodded. "So am I." Inside the box were only a few things. An old pocket watch that no longer worked. Dad's military dog tags. A faded photograph of me sitting on his shoulders at a county fair when I was maybe 5 years old. I stared at the picture for a long time. I didn't even remember that day. Beneath the photo sat a small brass key. Nothing else. No explanation. No letter. No note. Just a key. "What does it open?" Ryan asked. "I have no idea." Even stranger, the bottom of the box looked thicker than it should have. I pressed gently against the wood. Nothing happened. "It feels solid." Ryan shrugged. "Maybe it's just how he built it." Maybe. That night, I stayed in my old bedroom. Sleep never came. Around 2 in the morning, I walked downstairs for water. As I passed Dad's workshop, I noticed the light was on. Ryan stood inside, looking through filing cabinets. "You couldn't sleep either?" He smiled weakly. "Not really." "What are you looking for?" "Business records." He sighed. Dad kept saying there were files I'd need. I stepped farther into the workshop. Everything looked untouched, except one desk drawer hanging slightly open. "What about that?" Ryan frowned. I already checked. Empty. Almost. Something caught my eye behind the drawer. A folded yellow envelope had slipped between the back of the drawer and the desk itself. It would have been impossible to see, unless the drawer came all the way out. I reached behind it and pulled it free. There was no name on the front. Just one sentence written in Dad's handwriting. Only open if the box reaches Ethan, unopened. Ryan and I looked at each other. Neither of us spoke. Very slowly, I slid one finger beneath the sealed flap. The paper inside crackled as I pulled it free. The first line stole the breath from my lungs. If you're reading this, someone ignored my final instructions, and my real will has disappeared. If you're reading this, someone ignored my final instructions, and my real will has disappeared. I read the sentence twice before my brain accepted what my eyes were seeing. Ryan leaned closer. What does it say after that? My hands were shaking as I unfolded the rest of the letter. Dad's handwriting filled both sides of the page. Ethan, if this letter reached you, then something happened that I never intended. Mr. Holloway has a newer will, but it was never meant to replace the one I signed afterward. I made changes because I realized I had spent too many years treating you like a visitor instead of my son. The final version divided everything fairly between you and Ryan. More importantly, it explained why. If that will cannot be found, then someone either ignored my instructions or never received them. Before you assume the worst, hear me out. Don't blame Ryan. He knew nothing about this. The brass key in the box opens the bottom drawer of my old drafting cabinet. Inside is everything you'll need. I hope, for once, you believe me when I say this. I was trying to make things right. Dad. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Ryan finally broke the silence. I swear to you. I know. You didn't even let me finish. Because, I believe you. He looked relieved enough that I thought he might cry. The drafting cabinet sat against the opposite wall. It was an old oak cabinet Dad had used for blueprints before everything became digital. I'd walked past it 100 times growing up. I knelt in front of the bottom drawer. The brass key slid into the lock perfectly. For a second, I couldn't bring myself to turn it. Then I did. The drawer clicked open. Inside wasn't another will. It was a thick accordion folder, labeled in black marker. Personal. I carried it over to the workbench while Ryan stood beside me. Inside were neatly organized documents. Property deeds, tax returns, insurance papers, photographs, and clipped to the front, another envelope. This one had both our names on it. I opened it. Ethan and Ryan, if you're reading this together, then maybe there's still hope. I glanced at Ryan before continuing. I spent years convincing myself that providing for my family was the same thing as being there for them. It wasn't trying. You gave your life to my business. Ethan, you built your own life despite believing I wasn't proud of you. The truth is, I was proud of both of you. I just wasn't good at saying it. I stopped for a moment. Those were words I'd waited my entire life to hear. Dad continued. The revised will leaves the company to Ryan because he earned it. The remaining estate was to be divided equally after Linda's lifetime rights to the farmhouse. That was my final decision. Ryan looked at me. So, there really was another will. Apparently, there was. We searched every document in the folder. No signed will. Just notes. Copies of older estate plans. A checklist in Dad's handwriting. Near the bottom was one line with a checkmark beside it. Deliver revised original to Holloway. Ryan frowned. If he checked it off, then he thought he'd delivered it. The next morning we drove straight to Mr. Holloway's office. He looked genuinely surprised when I placed the letter on his desk. He read it silently. Then he leaned back. I've never seen this before. What about the revised will? He frowned. The one I have is the latest version I ever received. Dad's letter was sitting right in front of him. It says otherwise. I understand. He stood and disappeared into a records room. A few minutes later he returned carrying several storage boxes. For every estate planning matter, We keep correspondence. For almost an hour, we searched through letters, invoices, and appointment notes. Finally, Mr. Holloway stopped. This is strange. He handed me a copy of an email printed years earlier. It was from Dad. The subject line read, "Final estate documents, the body was short. My assistant will bring over the signed originals Friday afternoon. Mr. Holloway looked confused. I never received them. Are you sure? I billed your father for preparing them, but not for reviewing executed originals." Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. Dad's assistant. We both said the next name at the same time. Carol. Carol had worked at the construction company for almost 25 years. She handled schedules, invoices, payroll, basically everything. After Dad passed away, she'd retired almost immediately. Mr. Holloway looked thoughtful. If she was supposed to deliver them, then, maybe they never made it here, I finished. Neither Ryan nor I wanted to believe the worst. Carol had always been kind to both of us. She'd given me cookies after school when I was little. She remembered every birthday. She wasn't the kind of person who stole documents. Or so I thought. Ryan called her. She answered immediately. When he explained what we'd found, she sounded confused. I have no idea what you're talking about. Can we come by? There was a pause. Sure. She lived about 30 minutes outside town. When we arrived, she invited us in before we'd even knocked. She looked nervous. Not guilty. Just nervous. Ryan placed Dad's letter on her kitchen table. Do you remember taking estate papers to Mr. Holloway? She stared at the page for a long time. Then something changed in her expression. Oh! What? I remember now. She slowly stood. I never delivered them. Ryan blinked. What? I was supposed to. She walked into another room. I got a call that Robert had collapsed at the job site. She returned carrying an old leather briefcase. I drove straight to the hospital. She set it on the table. When everything happened. She closed her eyes. I completely forgot. My heart started pounding. She opened the briefcase. Inside were dozens of old files. Meeting notes, contracts, blueprints. Near the bottom, rested a large sealed envelope. Across the front, in Dad's handwriting, were 4 words. Signed estate documents, nobody moved. Carol covered her mouth. I can't believe. Her voice cracked. I forgot. There wasn't anger in the room. Just disbelief. 25 years of loyal work. 1 terrible week. 1 unimaginable emergency. 1 forgotten envelope. She looked absolutely devastated. I'm so sorry. Ryan reached over and squeezed her shoulder. You didn't do this on purpose. She nodded through tears. I've lived with that briefcase sitting in my office for months because I couldn't bear to open anything that reminded me of Robert. There was nothing to say. Grief had created a mistake, not a conspiracy. Mr. Holloway examined the documents that afternoon. The signatures were valid. The witnesses were present. The dates matched Dad's letter. Legally, it was the most recent will, exactly as Dad had described. Ryan inherited Carter Construction. Linda retained the right to live in the farmhouse for the rest of her life. Everything else, the investment accounts, rental properties, savings, and remaining assets, would be divided equally between Ryan and me. It wasn't the money that hit me. It was seeing my father's actual intentions in black and white. For the first time in my life, I had proof that he'd tried to fix what he'd broken. A week later, Ryan asked me to meet him at the company office. I've been thinking. That's dangerous. He laughed. Probably. He opened a drawer and pulled out the old wooden box. I think Dad knew we'd end up opening this together. I think so too. Ryan leaned back. You know, I always thought he admired me more. I looked at him. But I also spent years wishing I could do what you did. What? You left. I frowned. I never had the courage. That surprised me. You wanted to. I stayed because it made him happy. He shrugged. I don't even know if construction was ever my dream. For the first time, I realized favoritism hurts more than one person. Ryan had spent years trying to become the son Dad wanted. I'd spent years trying to accept that I wasn't. Neither of us won. Over the following months, we actually became close. Not because of the inheritance, because we finally stopped seeing each other as competitors. There had never really been a competition. Just two boys trying to earn approval in different ways. Linda apologized one afternoon, while packing away some of Dad's clothes. I should have noticed. What? How often he overlooked you? I smiled sadly. You weren't the one making those decisions. No. She folded another shirt. But I could have said more. Maybe she could have. Maybe all of us could have. That's the difficult thing about families. Sometimes, nobody intends to cause lasting pain. It happens anyway. Almost a year after everything was settled, Ryan and I stood together outside Dad's grave. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally I said, I wish he'd told me while he was alive. Ryan nodded. Me too. It would have saved everyone a lot of heartache. It would have. The wind moved gently through the trees. I looked down at the small wooden box in my hands. I still kept it, not because it held anything valuable anymore, because it reminded me that people are complicated. My father failed me in ways that shaped my entire childhood. He also spent the last year of his life quietly trying to make amends. He simply ran out of time. I don't pretend that one corrected will erased decades of feeling invisible. It didn't. Healing doesn't work like that. But knowing the truth changed something inside me. For years I believed my father had looked at everything he'd built and decided I wasn't worth remembering. The hidden letter proved something very different. He had realized his mistakes. He had tried to make things right, and through nothing more sinister than grief, timing, and a forgotten briefcase, the one document that could have explained everything never reached the person who was supposed to receive it. Life isn't always destroyed by villains. Sometimes it's changed by ordinary human mistakes. The estate was eventually settled, exactly as my father intended. Ryan continued running the business. I stayed in software engineering. Every few months we'd grab dinner, argue about football, and laugh about how neither of us could believe we were finally acting like brothers. In the end, the greatest inheritance my father left me wasn't half the estate. It was the chance to stop wondering whether he ever loved me at all. The answer had been hidden in an old wooden box all along.